Hello, welcome to my channel. My name is Anne, and today I am talking about classics, reading them and learning to love them. Many people have said to me, or I've heard them say, I want to read more classics, but I don't know where to start. Or they will say, I want to read more classics, but I find them boring. I find that I didn't like this one that I read. I find it hard to get into. I have also heard many people read a classic piece of literature and they have strongly disliked it and they haven't learned how to appreciate it. It's our mission if we choose to accept it. We don't have to, but if we choose to accept it, there is something objectively good that we can find in the vast majority of classic literary works that are out there that have stood the test of time, that have been enjoyed by many generations, and that are still being enjoyed by people today. If we want to, we can take the time to figure out what it is that people see in this book, what do they love about it, and why. So that's what I want to talk about today. If you want to read more classics, but you have had some false starts, you haven't enjoyed the ones you've dabbled in, or you don't really understand what all the fuss is, or you don't know where to start, this is for you. If you don't care about classics, that's perfectly fine. Not everybody has to love them, but I do think that there is a treasure trove of wisdom, of goodness, and of beauty and truth in classic literature, and I think it's worth digging through it to find out what it is that is wonderful about it and learning to enjoy it. So that's what I want to talk about today. First of all, I want to clarify some terms. So classic books, for the sake of my readathon that I do throughout the year, my reading challenge through the year, reading the classics, I define books simply as how old they are. It's an easy standard that is very concrete. So you can know if the book was published prior to 1976, then it qualifies, and there are no other qualifying factors. But the truth is that throughout the history of novel writing and books, there have been, or at least modern history, there have been popular books and literary works. Just like in the realm of music, there's popular music and there's more classical or art music. So there are classics and then there are classic books. And I would say that a lot of times when people think of reading the classics, they're not just thinking of reading old books, they're thinking of reading literary works, which those are literary classics rather than just being classic books. So nowadays we have the same thing. We have popular genre works of fiction, the popular cozy mysteries, the popular fantasies and romanticities and spy novels, etc., all of that. We have the genre fiction that is very plot driven and plot based. And then we have the literary fiction, which is a little bit more esoteric. It's a little bit at a higher intellectual level. It takes a little bit more effort to read and to understand and to appreciate it. And I would venture to say that the average modern person who reads literary fiction is also someone who enjoys classic literary fiction. And someone who enjoys mostly popular fiction will find classic literary works a little bit harder, a little bit less accessible than the popular fiction, just by its nature. Literary fiction tends to be about something other than the story that's actually happening. So there is a story, there is a plot, there are characters to one extent or another, depending on the author and the era in which they're writing. But there's always something behind that that's driving the book. There's always questions that are being grappled with about human nature or society or culture or history or theology. There are always thematic elements related to those questions. Maybe the author isn't asking questions, but they're playing out a scenario of various aspects of human nature or qualities of human nature or things along those lines. Very often literary fiction utilizes metaphor and symbolism to help convey these truths. There's something behind the story. It's not just the story itself. And it does take a little bit more effort to see what the author is doing and to be able to appreciate it than simply reading a story for the sake of the story. Now, can classics be read simply for the sake of their story? Yes. And I would argue that the best classics and the best works of literary fiction have a solid, enjoyable, compelling story along with whatever truth they are exploring or trying to convey in what they're writing. When the story is not as enjoyable or compelling, then I think that the message suffers, in my opinion. But there's also a lot of subjectivity that goes into it, so there's that to consider as well. The other thing that I want to say before I go on with actual tips is that it can be an acquired taste. For myself, I grew up reading classic literature. I read popular literature as a child, like the popular children's books and middle grade books, some of them, not all of them, but I read, like I was at the library all the time. So I read current books, but I also read a huge library of classic works as well, even as a child. Now I'm talking children's classics. And then that just continued as I grew. And it was just the culture that I grew up in. That was what was available to me. It was there. I read it. I wanted to read anything I could. I loved to read, so I just read everything. And it didn't really particularly matter to me too much. I didn't think of it in terms as, oh, this is a classic book I should read. I just read it because I wanted to. And that's the key thing there that I want to point out. I just read it because I wanted to. So for me, I acquired the taste early on in life. Not everyone has that background. Not everyone has that acquired taste. I did not develop a taste for coffee until I was a teenager. And when I started developing a taste for coffee, it was with, like really sugary drinks that were terrible for me, but were delicious and I loved them. But the more I drank coffee, the more I got into the flavors of coffee itself. And now I can drink coffee. I don't always, or often even, but I can drink black coffee or straight espresso, and I can enjoy it. I can enjoy the flavors of it, which when I was a teenager, I never would have imagined being able to do. So there is an element of acquiring a taste for it. Initially, it may not seem enjoyable, but I would encourage anyone to not give up, to press forward. And I think also these tips that I have for kind of acquiring that taste will be very helpful and give you a little bit of guidance on your journey to learning to appreciate the classics better, if that is what you want to do. And that brings me to my first tip, which is really the only don't that I have on my list. And it's a really big one. Don't pick up a classic piece of literature just because everybody reads it and they say it's good, or it's on the list of the top 10 classics that you should read, whatever. Don't read it just because it's a classic that you think you should read. In my opinion, when I pick up a book that I think that I should read, I am far more likely not to enjoy it than I am to actually enjoy it. Now, have I read plenty of books that I felt like I should read, even though I didn't particularly want to? Yes. Have I ended up enjoying them? Also, yes. But I've also definitely had the experience where I read a book because I felt like I should, and then I read it, and I was like, why? Why did I waste my time on that? I didn't need to read that. So I would recommend, especially at the beginning of your journey, if you're wanting to develop a taste for classics, don't just read a book because they say it's good. Even me, okay? So I love Pride and Prejudice. I think it's one of the, if not the best, English novel that's out there, but it may not be the place for you to start. You may have to acquire a taste for that kind of writing. So where should you start then? I have seen where people they want to read classics, so they come across a classic, they're like, oh, I've heard about this one, I've heard about this author, I'm gonna pick it up, I'm gonna try and read it. And then they read it and they're like, don't do that. Be a little bit more strategic in your choices and start from a place where you already know you enjoy it, okay? So for example, let's go back to the acquiring the taste for coffee idea. When I was younger, a teenager, I already enjoyed hot chocolate because it's sweet, right? Who doesn't love hot chocolate? So then I started to drink beverages that were very similar to hot chocolate. I know a lot of kids, like they love milkshakes or smoothies, and so they drink the frappuccinos, and that's when they start acquiring their taste for coffee. So start with something that you already know that you love. And that is where I would begin my journey with classics. Now, here are a couple of suggestions of how you can do that. First of all, start with something that will not be difficult, something that is easier, something that will pique your interest, something that will kind of dip your toe into that language, the more literary language or older language, because classics are older works, so they use older language, and that can be difficult in and of itself. The language itself can be a barrier. But if you start with simpler versions or versions that already interest you, that's already appealing to you, then you'll be much more likely to enjoy it, and then you can take another step. So we're gonna like wade into the water, we're going to acquire a taste and see where it takes us from there. To begin with, be like a child acquiring a taste for something, whatever it is, learning to get out of your picky phase of not wanting to eat broccoli and learning to enjoy it. And start with children's classics. So I love, for example, Anne of Green Gables. If you have never read it, fantastic place to start. There's humor, there's incredible human character insight in there. There is incredible drawing of human characters. There's humor, did I mention that? And it's kind of a bit of a vignette sort of story. So there's a plot in that there's the whole series goes through the arc of Anne's life, but there's not really like a strong plot. So that is one drawback. If you really love plot-driven books, there won't be as much of a plot. But those little vignettes, those scenes from Anne's childhood as she grows and matures into a young woman are just charming, delightful. The descriptions are beautiful without being excessive or unapproachable. And it's just a delight to read. Anne is a delight of a character for most people. Or, for example, Little House, particularly if you have watched and enjoyed the Little House series, you would probably enjoy the Little House books as well. Those are very easy to read. And other children's books like A Little Princess or The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. There are hundreds of children's classics I could name that would be an excellent place for you to start. And I recommend that because they're shorter, because they're intended for children with shorter attention spans. And they do have more plot in them. They're more focused on the plot than the themes necessarily. And also because they're written for children, the thematic elements are more obviously drawn out through the story. It's not hidden as much as it is in classic literary fiction for adults. So it's a lot easier to see what the author is trying to say because they're a little bit more straightforward with it. And it's really just a wonderful time, the classic children's literature. So I would say start with children's classic literature and don't be ashamed or embarrassed about it because they're written for adults too. They're easily enjoyed by adults. Just because it's marketed toward children or children are the main character or the author wrote it with children in mind doesn't mean that adults cannot read it and enjoy it as well. So I would definitely recommend as a starting point to start with children's literature. I don't think you can go wrong there. Secondly, I would say to try watching an adaptation first, like a movie or a mini series. Period dramas are a great way to suck you into a story. There have been quite a few books that I've seen first as a movie or a mini series and enjoyed them and then read the book, and vice versa. But I usually, I think it's actually better sometimes to watch the mini series or movie first and then get the book because the book gives you more. Whereas when you read the book and then you watch the mini series, you're always a little bit disappointed many times. So actually, I think it might be better to watch the mini series or the adaptation first, get an idea for the story, get the basics, because it's going to cut out a lot, and it's going to cut out a lot of the inner dialogue that might be happening or the analysis in the narration of the story, etc. So you might want to watch the miniseries first, or the TV, or the movie, and then read the book. But regardless, it is a great way to get into classics. And so many of classic authors, Dickens, Gaskell, Austen, etc., Shakespeare, and there are movie adaptations of their books. And so it's easy to find one. There are many of them even available free on YouTube, or if you have Amazon Prime or something like that, and you can watch them and then try the book. There's also musicals. That's how I acquired a taste for Les Miserables by Victor Hugo, and how I discovered Victor Hugo was because I loved the musical, and then I read the book, and yeah, now it's one of my favorite books of all time. So musicals, even plays. My husband and I have gone and enjoyed many plays together. That's a fun way to experience a book and the story first in a very visual way, and then you can tackle the actual book afterwards when you have a structure to base it on. And along those lines, my next tip would be to read an abridged or adapted version of the story. You can read a children's edition of a story. Now, classic purists would howl at me for this, but I don't care. I think it's a very valid approach, because what if someone is able to read and enjoy a graphic novel version of a book that they wouldn't ever touch the actual full-length tome? I mean, they've gained something, right? They may not have gained everything that is in the final product, but they've gained an appreciation. Or you may read a graphic novel of something and you might think, well, that was okay, but I didn't love it, and you have zero interest in reading the actual novel. That's perfectly fine. That's perfectly legitimate. Or you may read it and you may think, oh, that's good, and you may try the actual full-length novel. Either way, I think it's better to get a glimpse of what the book is about before going full bore for the whole thing, especially if you're not sure if you will end up loving it or not. So graphic novels, children's editions, abridged versions. Like I said, Les Miserables, the musical, was my first exposure to that story. And then I read an abridged version, which was about a third the size of the actual book. And then I was able to tackle the full thing. And by the time I got to the full thing, I was ready to love it. Whereas if I had started with that, I would have gotten bogged down very early on, and I may not have ever finished it. So I think that it's perfectly valid to take a lesser version of a book and just taste test it. See if you like it. And if you don't like what you're tasting, set it aside and move on. No harm, no foul, in my opinion. But if you learn to love it, then that might make you interested in the actual thing. So I think it's worth trying personally. And I am fully in support of adaptations, book adaptations, classic adaptations, children's versions, etc. I say go for it. And my next two tips are kind of related, so I kind of will put them together. Whatever type of book you like to read, because people have a variety of genres that they typically are drawn to. So that might be, like I said, fantasy or spy novels or adventure novels or true crime or etc., all of those things. People also are drawn to certain tropes and or they dislike certain tropes. So even classic literature utilizes tropes because they're just common to the human experience. So if you know of a trope that you like or dislike, do a little research on a book that interests you. Do a little research beforehand to see what tropes are in it, what's the basic storyline, what's happening in the story, to kind of know if you will like it or not. So it would just give you an idea. This video is not of the scope enough for me to go through and say, if you like this trope, then you'll love this classic novel. That definitely would be a fun series, but I don't have time for that today. However, I would suggest just do a little research, do a little Google searching, and see if you can find some books that are similar to tropes that you enjoy, or vice versa, a book that you're interested in. Look it up and find out what's going on in this story. You may be like, that might not be something I would enjoy. I won't go for that right now. But along those lines, my other tip would be, as I started out the video talking about the difference between just plain classic books that are also genre driven versus classic literary fiction, which is more message or theme driven in a lot of ways. It's a very simplistic way of separating the two categories, but we'll go with simplicity here and oversimplify if we have to. There is still value in reading books that have stood the test of time, even if they're not literary fiction. So these books that are still being published, that they're still in print, they may not be classic literature, but they are a step in that direction. The further you step back in time, the further you remove yourself from our current contemporary culture of understanding. And so the more you have to accustom yourself to the language and culture of the past. It's a different place there, right? They did different things there. They spoke differently. The language was different. The writing was different. It was all different. And the further back you go, the more different it is. So if you have never read or enjoyed classics at all, I think that it's perfectly fine to start with mid-century, and by mid-century I mean mid-20th century classic books in your favorite genre if you've never tried them. So whether that's westerns or spy stories or adventure novels or romances, historic fiction, romantic suspense, like there are authors who wrote in all those genres then, whose books are still widely available today. I'm talking from the 50s, 60s, 70s. And you would probably enjoy them more than you would picking up a book, a Gothic novel from the late 18th century, okay? They're going to be very different things. So even though you might like Gothic fantasy type books now, you pick up one from the 18th century and you're gonna be like, what is this? So maybe work your way backwards a little bit through time, be a little time travel, and start with something closer to our time period, but that's still classic, and kind of adjust yourself to that culture, and then maybe move backwards. And then in the early 20th century, again, there were people who were writing all of these kinds of books and all these kinds of genres. Find one that you might have liked and enjoyed. So vintage books, vintage authors, classic genre fiction, try it all. And in the genre that you are particularly interested in, and even if it's not classic literature, it's still a step in that direction to help acclimate your tastes and acquire a taste for classic literary fiction in the end. Earlier I said don't ever pick a book just because you're told that you should read it. It's a great classic that everybody should read. Pick a book that genuinely interests you. The storyline sounds interesting. The setting sounds interesting. Don't just read it because they said it was good. Read it because you want to read it. That's my number one tip. The last thing I want to say, the further you go in your journey of acquiring a taste for classic fiction, the deeper you're going to get into books that may be more difficult to understand. So if that's where you are in your journey, then I recommend enlisting help. Reading is best done in community, particularly literary fiction. Whether that means a buddy read with someone else, I can't tell you how much more enriching it is to read a book with a buddy than just to read it on my own. You will get much more out of the story when you have the perspective of someone else together with you. Or in a Facebook group, there are group reads. Booktubers have group reads and group discussions about the books they're reading. Discord servers, definitely engage in that community reading of classic literature that will enhance your experience so much more. But also, even if nobody is actively reading with you, you can kind of get that community reading experience by listening to podcasts or watching YouTube videos about the particular novel or the author you are reading. I have done that in the past, particularly with books that I have found difficult to understand or have not been enjoying as much, and I know I'm just not getting it. So I have listened to podcasts and people discussing the book as they're reading it or analyzing the book after they have read it, etc. And I have gotten so much more out of it. And I think it's definitely a very helpful way to gain an appreciation for what the author is doing. One example for me in particular is The Great Gatsby. On its surface, as a novel, it's not a story that I would ever appreciate on my own. It took the insight of someone else who was more experienced in the realm of classic literature to help me understand exactly what F. Scott Fitzgerald was exploring in this story and some of the symbolism and the metaphors. Like, some of them were obvious, but some of them I wasn't fully getting what he was saying. And listening to other people discuss it with a higher level of understanding than I had at the time that I read it was so beneficial to me, and I gained so much appreciation for that story so that I actually enjoyed it. Whereas, and that was on my reread of it, the first time I read it, I was like, what is this terrible story? This is like the worst story in the world. And then I reread it again because I was like, I know there's got to be something here that I'm missing. So I read it and I listened to the podcast along with reading it, and I gained so much appreciation for it and understanding for what F. Scott Fitzgerald was actually saying in the story. And now I actually have a true appreciation for The Great Gatsby. Is it my favorite story that I will read and reread and love? No, but I appreciate it. I have a respect for it. And also, I went to see the musical of it in New York City last year with my husband and thoroughly enjoyed the experience. It wasn't a perfect production, it wasn't a perfect adaptation, but I enjoyed the story enough to be able to want to do that. Other options are like lit charts or spark notes or things of that nature that kind of give you the rundown on the characters and the plot and the metaphors and symbolism that might be in the story that you might overlook, and just give you some insight into what you're reading. I also definitely look those up. Another thing is, I should have mentioned this earlier when I was saying to read an abridged or adapted version. There's No Fear Shakespeare, where they put Shakespeare's works in modern language, and I think that that can be a really great first introduction to Shakespeare. There are also children's versions of his works. I like to read annotated versions of certain classic works because the annotations and the insights are so helpful in understanding the story. When I read Jane Austen's annotated, the annotated versions of Jane Austen's works this past year, it was such an enriching experience. I already knew and I already loved Austen, but just that aspect of learning more about the context of some of the scenes in her books and some of the aspects of culture, like the finance and the economics, or the social or philosophical debates of the day, or the trends at the time that Jane Austen is weaving into her story or questioning or addressing, whatever. I found it very interesting. And so I do enjoy reading a classic work that's been annotated so that I can have a little bit more understanding of certain aspects of the story, what the author is saying. Because again, history is a different place. It's a different culture. It's a different time. And so we might need a little bit of help in understanding it. So don't be ashamed to read with help. In fact, I would say don't try to read a piece of classic literature without a little help, especially if you have never read it before. Even now, when I am reading classic works of literature, I enjoy listening to analysis and discussion of it, or reading annotations, etc., because it's so much more enriching to the experience than just reading it on my own and just getting a surface level understanding of what's happening in the story. So those are my thoughts on developing a taste for classic literature. Let me know in the comments if you found any of this helpful. Also, let me know in the comments where you are in your classic loving journey. Were you like me and you've been reading classics for just about forever and you just naturally love them? Or is it something that you want to do but you didn't know where to start, or you've had some false starts and you haven't enjoyed some of the classics that you've tried? Let me know in the comments. And if you are a classics lover, what classic would you recommend other people start with? Maybe a children's work of literature or a shorter work that's more accessible, that's maybe more plot driven. Let everybody know in the comments, give your recommendations so that people watching this video can find some suggestions. And I will chat with you next time. Bye.